Hello class, this is going to be today a lecture which continues on talking about political parties, and we're going to ask a couple of questions in regard to political parties, and the questions are going to be: why are they still important? What's the difference and what does it mean to be a Democrat versus a Republican? And then lastly, who are the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of demographics? And once we finish that little part of political parties, then we're going to go to the next section, which deals with political participation and elections and voting and campaigns, which is Chapter 7 and Chapter 9. So make sure you read Chapter 7 and Chapter 9. The last time we spoke, what I talked about was the evolution of political parties and the two-party system in the United States, and I used terms like critical or realigning elections, deviating elections, maintaining elections, and then finally, in describing where we are now, I said we were in this period of de-alignment, where parties are not quite as important as they were previously. That more and more people are considering themselves independents. Now, having said that, what I want to do is emphasize that doesn't mean that political parties are not important in our contemporary society. They're just a little less important. So again, if you look at the statistics that I gave you, in 1964, 75% of the public called themselves either Democrats or Republicans. They were partisans, with only about 25% of the population being independents. And then when we looked at the statistics in 2016, we said 31% of the public called themselves Democrats, 27% called themselves Republicans, with the rest being independents or non-affiliated. So that still means that the majority of the American people, 58%, still call themselves partisans, Democrats or Republican. It's just a much smaller number by 17 percentage points. But this is still an important phenomenon to understand, party affiliation. And the question is, why is it so important to understand? And the reason it's so important to understand is because of the impact that partisanship has on voters. And what I mean by that is, what we see is that someone who is a Democrat or someone who is a Republican acts very differently in terms of their voting behavior and their perception of issues. So I'm going to give you an overview of the difference between Democrats and Republicans. In other words, those people who call themselves Democrats and those people who call themselves Republicans in regard to how they actually vote for the last three presidential elections. So in 2008, among Republicans, 90% of people who said they were Republicans voted for John McCain. Only 9% voted for Obama. Among Democrats, 89% of Democrats voted for Obama, and only 10% voted for John McCain. Then in 2012, when Mitt Romney ran against Obama, 93% of Republicans voted for Romney and only 6% for Obama. Among Democrats, 92% voted for Obama and only 7% for Romney. And if we look at the last presidential election in 2016, we find that among Republicans, 88% voted for Trump and only 8% voted for Clinton, with 4% voting for a third-party candidate. Among Democrats, 89% voted for Clinton and 8% voted for Trump. So, one of the things you see is that if you do have a party identification, it has a major impact on who you're going to vote for. And we see that not just with the presidential candidates, but with congressional candidates, candidates for the Senate, candidates for the House of Representation. So party affiliation is still incredibly important to understand. Now, within this context, what we want to ask is, what do we mean by a Democrat and what do we mean by a Republican? So what is a Democrat? What is a Republican? And when I say, what is, I mean, what's the difference in terms of their philosophy of government, their ideology? And if you remember back at the beginning of this semester, we talked about values, government and values. What do you want government to do? What value system? So we talked about freedom versus order. And we talked about freedom versus equality. So if you're a Democrat or a Republican, think about where you fall in regard to these two major conflicts in values. Again, remembering we call one the original conflict and the other one the contemporary conflict. And what we see is Democrats and Republicans differ a great deal in regard to these various issues. So when we look at ideology, we find that Democrats, in regard to the freedom versus equality issue, tend to stress equality. And in regard to freedom versus order, then they talk a little bit more about freedom. So Democrats, for the most part, in regard to freedom versus order, look for freedom, and in regard to freedom versus equality, care about equality. And you can see that in regard to their approach. So what we're saying is if you look at a Democrat, their social philosophy is one that's more willing to expand social services, that's more critical of the free market and big business, is more supportive of the idea of progressive taxes, believes in more regulation of big business and more redistribution of wealth, more supportive of affirmative action programs. And these approaches differ significantly from Republicans. Republicans, as we said in regard to freedom versus equality, tend to be much more supportive of the whole idea of freedom. So they are much more supportive of a free market. They're much less concerned about the issue of economic distribution and redistribution. Whatever the market does, that's what it does. Less of a commitment to promoting social and welfare programs and services. More opposed to business regulation. More opposed to government intervention and regulation of the economy. So as you can see, there is a significant difference between Democrats and Republicans. And these differences become very apparent when you look at congressional roll call voting. So when you look at a host of issues, and if you look at them even today, there's significant differences between Democrats and Republicans on issues such as the minimum wage, health care reform, tax reform, anti-poverty programs, the Medicare, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act, Civil Rights Act, Social Security, air and water pollution regulation. So if you look at these issues, for almost every one of these issues, there is a tremendous divide. So, for example, unemployment benefits. We find that almost 90% of Democrats favor more benefits in regard to unemployed workers. whereas only 20% of Republicans support that. Increasing the minimum wage, 88% of Democrats favor that, versus 22% of Republicans. Progressive tax reform, that in other words would tax the wealthy more than middle class or lower income. 86% of Democrats favor that versus 21% of Republicans. The Affordable Care Act, over 90% of Democrats favor that, whereas only 10% of Republicans said they favored it. And we see these same kinds of patterns for a lot of things, and even in terms of current debates. So for example, Congress is debating this whole idea of the coronavirus bill and how we should structure it, where the money should go, this $2 trillion bill. And as you can see, there was a lot of infighting between Democrats and Republicans and name calling. Democrats saying Republicans don't care about the average person, Republicans saying Democrats are going to screw the entire country and we'll have economic collapse. Well, what's the real debate about? The real debate is that Democrats want to give more of this money directly to individuals and middle class and lower income people, whereas Republicans want to give more of the money to large corporations to ensure their economic viability. Different philosophies of how do you approach economic issues. So Democrats say we believe in giving the money to the people and let them spend it as they want. Republicans are believing that we have to give it to the big companies that employ a lot of people, and there'll be this trickle-down approach. So significant differences there. A significant difference in terms of unemployment benefits. So Democrats want to increase unemployment benefits during this time of crisis, where unemployment is starting to skyrocket, as we see with unemployment claims that just came out yesterday. And Republicans oppose that. And their argument is, if we give people too much money for unemployment, they'll lose their incentive to want to work. So again, different beliefs, different philosophies of the role of government. And there are therefore then significant differences between Democrats and Republicans. Which leads to the last question that we want to ask in regard to this whole thing about political parties. And that's the question of who's a Democrat and who's a Republican in terms of demographics. Who's a Democrat, who's a Republican? So I looked at surveys that analyzed the three major presidential elections and how different demographic groups voted in those presidential elections. So let me just give you an example. First, we looked at gender. And the question there was, are voting patterns different for men versus women? And we find this, yes they are. Yes they are. So if you look at Trump versus Clinton, Trump got 52% of the vote from men, whereas Clinton only got 41% of the male vote. But among women, Clinton got 54% and Trump got 41%. So Trump wins overwhelmingly among men and Clinton wins overwhelmingly among women. Now a lot of you might say, well, okay, that's because Clinton is a woman, so women wanted to vote for women. Well, that's not the explanation, because if you look to prior elections, what you see, for example, is Obama did even better than Clinton among women. So he got 55% of the women vote in 2012 and 56% of the women vote in 2008. And for men, what you can see is in 2012, when it was Obama versus Romney, Romney got the same 52% that Trump got. So this difference based upon gender is pretty consistent for all presidential elections. What we see is a gender gap. Men supporting Republican presidential candidates, women supporting Democratic presidential candidates. All right, well, let's look at the next category, the category of race. And when we talk about racial breakdowns, obviously what we're doing is we're looking at the disparity between white voters and minority voters. And again, it's significant. So if you look at Trump versus Clinton, among white voters, Trump got 57% of the vote. Clinton got 37%. He beats her by 20 points among white voters. And by the way, again, that's not different than past elections. So Obama-Romney gets 59% of the vote, and Obama gets 39% of the vote. Again, a 20 percentage point difference. But then when you look at minority voters, a big change. So, among African American voters, when you look at Obama versus Romney, Obama got 93% of African American voters. Romney got 6%. The largest disparity of any characteristic that we ever surveyed. Now, again, the point of, well, that's because Obama was an African American, so African Americans wanted to vote for an African American. But the point is we saw it's the same kind of thing for Clinton. So Hillary Clinton got 89% of the African American vote to only 8% for Trump. So the African American vote has been hardcore Democratic, the most Democratic voting group in the United States. Among Hispanics, again, a significant disparity. Clinton got 66% of the vote, Trump got 28% of the vote, and then in 2012, among Hispanics, Obama got 71% of the vote, Romney got 27% of the vote. And the same thing for Asians. Among Asians, Obama got 73% of the vote to only 26% for Romney. Clinton got 65% of the Asian vote to only 27% for Trump. So when we look at this issue of race, again, significant differences. The white vote, significantly Republican. The minority vote, significantly Democratic. So both of these things show significant differences. Age. We see that age makes a big difference. So young voters, the youngest group, 18 through 29, tends to be much more Democratic. So if you look at Obama-McCain, 66% went for Obama, 32% went for McCain. If you look at Obama-Romney, 60% went for Obama, 37% went for Romney. If you look at Clinton-Trump, 55% went for Clinton, 36% went for Trump. So among the youngest voters, when we look at this factor of age, a significant difference. Young voters tend to vote Democrat for president. Now, old voters, 65 and plus, okay, what we see is it goes the other direction. So Trump got 52%, Clinton got 45%. With Romney-Obama, Romney, the Republican, got 56%, Obama 44%. Obama-McCain, Obama the Democrat, 45%, McCain the Republican, 53%. So age has a major impact. And when you look at this and say, well, you know, okay, so young voters more overwhelmingly supportive of their candidate than older voters are, you know, why doesn't their candidate win? We find that the major reason for that is the differential in voter turnout. Senior voters are the most dedicated voters. In other words, They're the ones who make sure they come in and vote. Their voter turnout is very, very high. The lowest voter turnout is among young voters. And that's why their votes don't have more of an impact than senior votes. Education. Is there a difference here? So what we've done is we've compared the lowest educational groups to the highest educational groups. So those with a high school degree or less, and we find among those with a high school degree or less, Donald Trump did very well. He got 51% of the vote to 46% for Clinton. And then when we compare that to the highest educated, which would be post-college, in other words, some graduate education, a complete change. Clinton gets 58% of the vote, Trump gets 37% of the vote. So, is there a difference by education? Yes. Lower education tend to vote more Republican, higher education tend to vote more Democratic. And then the last category, income. What we find with income is that the lower income groups tend to vote more Democratic. So for example, for people who are earning under $50,000 a year, 52% of them tend to vote for the Democratic candidate and for Clinton in 2016, whereas only 40% voted for Trump. But among the higher income groups, for example, those who are earning over $100,000, we see about 48% of those voted for Trump and about 46% voted for Clinton. So income also has a major impact. And a lot of this kind of makes sense if you think of it, again, in terms of these concepts of freedom versus equality. So what kind of groups would believe government should have to do more, that government should intervene? We find that women feel that they've been discriminated against and women can do more to help them and their families. We find that minority groups, whether it's Hispanics or African Americans, again, feel that there's significant inequalities in society and that government should do something about it. In regard to education, the same thing in regard to income. So if you're in a lower income group, you feel as though it's hard to get ahead. You want government to do more, help us out, make our lives better. So I would say that when you look at the differences between the party, the differences in how people vote by these significant demographics is not very surprising. It's not surprising. So the thing we've done is we've looked at this whole question of these differences, and we see that there are significant consistencies in terms of what we found. All right. What I want to do now is I want to go on to a new topic, and specifically what we want to start talking about is this topic of participation and voting in the United States. Participation and voting in the United States. So we have an outline for you that will be provided. And within that context, we're talking about chapters 7 and chapters 9. So chapter 7 is about participation and voting. Chapter 9 is about nominations, elections, and campaigns. So the first thing we want to do in regard to this topic is ask the question of what are we talking about in regard to political participation? What is political participation? And the book defines for you political participation in the book. It says it's the actions of private citizens by which they seek to influence or support government, and politics. So again, the actions of private citizens by which they seek to influence or support government and politics. So it's the actions we take as citizens that we're hoping influences what government does or doesn't do. And the book then divides participation and political participation into two methods: unconventional participation and conventional participation. So it defines unconventional participation as relatively uncommon political behavior that challenges established institutions and the dominant norms. So they talk about things like terrorism. Now, obviously in the United States, unconventional participation is very minimal. So we're not really going to spend any time talking about unconventional participation. But we are going to spend a great deal of time talking about conventional participation. So what's that? So they define the book conventional participation as relatively routine political behavior that uses institutional channels and is acceptable to the dominant culture. So this is the kind of participation that we see as legitimate in trying to influence our government and its policies. Things like campaigning and voting, interest group behavior, writing letters. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to talk about. And in talking about conventional participation, obviously the most dominant method of conventional participation in the United States are elections. So we want to focus on elections for the purpose of the next lecture or two. And the first thing we want to do in terms of talking about elections is talk about the history of suffrage. The history of suffrage in the United States. What does the term suffrage mean? Suffrage is simply the right to vote. The right to vote. So the question we want to look at is, who has the right to vote in the United States? And how has that changed over time? Originally, the United States Constitution indicated that the determination of who has the right to vote is the province of the states. Province of the states. And remember, if we think back to the passage of our Constitution in 1789, the United States was the first country to provide for general election of representation through elections. And it was states that had the right to establish the qualifications for voting in their state. In other words, who could vote, who couldn't? When did you vote? How did you vote? What was a primary? What kind of primaries were there? What are the residency requirements to vote in a particular state? What are the voting rules? What are the eligibility requirements? So what we want to do is look at this history of suffrage and how it's changed in the United States. And if you look at the first major era we had in the United States, it would encompass the constitutional founding until the 1860s. And it's during this era that we said the states had a dominant role in defining who could vote. And in most states, the question of who can vote at this time was confined only to white males who own property. So if you look at our first national election, it's estimated that only 11% of the adult population actually voted. And if you think about why, I mean, some of the most obvious reasons, well, first of all, clearly African Americans couldn't vote at that time, and women couldn't vote. So right there, over 50% of your population wasn't even eligible to vote. And the impact of leaving voting qualifications to the states resulted in great disparities. Now again, what we're saying is, during this era, the only people who really had the right to vote at all were white males. Women couldn't vote. African Americans couldn't vote. So the question became, which white males could vote? In the most permissive states, 80% of white adult males were eligible to vote. In the most restrictive states, less than 10% of white males were eligible to vote. And nationally, about 25% of the country could vote. So just to give you an example, as many of you know, I own a home in Virginia. And the question is, by the standards of this time, would I have been able to vote? And the answer is no. Well, why not? Well, in Virginia at the time, in order to be able to vote, you had to own 25 acres of settled land or 500 acres of unsettled land. So I only owned 4 or 5 acres of land. I would not have been able to vote. And that was the initial standard. Now, by the 1860s, most of the states had extended suffrage to include most white adult males. But the first major reforms in regard to suffrage don't come about until the 1860s, as we said. And the 1860s witnessed the adoption of what we call the post-Civil War amendments. The 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and most importantly in terms of suffrage, the 15th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment is passed in 1865. It outlaws slavery. The 14th Amendment is passed in 1868, and it provides for the Equal Protection Clause. And the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870,